Hello and welcome to Trails Worth Hiking, the show that brings you some of the most interesting backpacking and trekking routes in the world. I'm your host, Jeremy Pendry. In the first part of the show, we bring you the story and history of a trail. Then we tell you what it's like to hike the trail and how you can do it. On this episode, instead of a point-to-point hiking route, we are going to climb a massive snow-capped dormant volcano on a trek that will take several days of slow ascent as we acclimatize for our highest altitude trek yet. Yep, we'll go even higher than Everest Base Camp, with the help of guides and porters, as we summit the highest mountain in Africa. In fact, the highest freestanding mountain in the world above sea level. Yep, you guessed it. On this episode of Trails Worth Hiking, we climb Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania. While it grew dark, they drank, and just before it was dark and there was no longer enough light to shoot, a hyena crossed the open on his way around the hill. "That bastard crosses there every single night," the man said. "Every night for 2 weeks. He's the one makes the noise at night. I don't mind it. They're a filthy animal, though." Drinking together with no pain now except the discomfort of lying in the one position, the boys lighting a fire, its shadow jumping on the tents, he could feel the return of acquiescence in this life of pleasant surrender. She was very good to him. He had been cruel and unjust in the afternoon. She was a fine woman, marvelous really. And just then it occurred to him that he was going to die. It came with a rush, not as a rush of water nor of wind, but of a sudden evil-smelling emptiness, and the odd thing was that the hyena slipped lightly along the edge of it. Okay, ... and then skipping to later in the story. And then instead of going on to Arusha, they turned left. He evidently figured that they had the gas, and looking down he saw a pink sifting cloud moving over the ground and in the air, like the first snow in a blizzard that comes from nowhere, and he knew the locusts were coming up from the south. Then they began to climb, and they were going to the east, it seemed. And then it darkened, and they were in a storm, the rain so thick it seemed like flying through a waterfall. And then they were out, and Compy turned his head and grinned and pointed, and there, ahead, all he could see, as wide as all the world, great, high, and unbelievably white in the sun, was the square top of Kilimanjaro. And then he knew that there was where he was going. Welcome, everyone, to Trails Worth Hiking. Thanks for joining me. Those passages I just read were, of course, from The Snows of Kilimanjaro, the famous Ernest Hemingway short story that takes place on the plains of Tanzania below Mount Kilimanjaro. It's a fantastic story about life and death and love and lust and our place in society, but most of all about regret and coming to terms with how we have lived or haven't lived our lives. And I thought we couldn't start an episode about Mount Kilimanjaro without it. So thanks for indulging me. Before we jump into more about Mount Kilimanjaro, though, I have a big announcement. I'm very excited to announce the launch of Trails Worth Hiking Adventures. Trails Worth Hiking is going to be collaborating with experienced adventure travel companies to bring you the opportunity to hike some fantastic trails. Some of the trails we've covered on the show and some we haven't yet covered, but will cover. These will be private group hikes put on by adventure travel companies for Trails Worth Hiking listeners and friends of the show. And I will personally be going on the hikes with you. We are launching Trails Worth Hiking Adventures with our first 2 offerings. Both of these adventures will be in 2026, so that you have plenty of time to plan for them if you want to go. First, in March 2026, we will be hiking the El Camino de Costa Rica, from the Caribbean Sea to the Pacific Ocean across Costa Rica. The trek goes through jungle, indigenous lands, and rural parts of Costa Rica that are wonderful but off the beaten path that other tourists travel in Costa Rica. We covered this hike in episode 50, so go back and listen if you're curious. For this trip, we'll be teaming up with Vegan Adventure Holidays. Emma Fry of Vegan Adventure Holidays was our guest on episode 50. I've worked with Emma to design a trip that I think will be fantastic for Trails Worth Hiking listeners. It will be a small group of up to about 10 people. You do not need to be a vegan or vegetarian to go on this trip. I just want to be clear about that. The food that Emma will arrange will be vegan, but it will be fantastic, locally prepared food that you will enjoy, whatever your diet. Emma has run this trip multiple times now and is really proud of how amazing the food is on this trip. And I know you'll enjoy it if you come. The trip includes daily luggage transfer, so you can carry only a day pack, and there is a support vehicle with water and snacks and other supplies that follows along the hiking group. The dates for the trip are going to be March 15th to probably March 28th. We're still nailing down the final range of the dates. So that's March 15th to March 28th, 2026. So that's the first trip. Second, in October 2026, we will be going to Nepal to hike the Annapurna Base Camp Trek, also known as the Annapurna Sanctuary Hike. You guys know how much I love Nepal, and I'm excited to go there with you if you can make it. For this trip, I've worked with Rajan Simkata of Earthbound Expeditions in Nepal to arrange an adventure that you will love. Rajan has been a guest on the show twice in episodes 14 and 59, and I described my experience with his company in episode 15 about my trek in Nepal in 2019. On this trek in October 2026, we'll start by visiting Kathmandu, the capital of Nepal. Then we'll take a short flight to Pokhara, an amazing lakeside city where we'll start the trek into some of the most beautiful mountains you'll ever see. Even though it is in the Himalayas, the altitudes on this trek are pretty reasonable, especially compared to some of the other treks in the region. After the trek, there will be an optional add-on to do a jeep safari in Chitwan National Park in Nepal, where you may be able to see rhinos, monkeys, and potentially even an elusive tiger. Again, I'll be on the trip. And for this one, I believe friend of the show, Tony Wong, is planning to join us as well. Though don't quote me on that until he has put his deposit down. In fact, Rajan is such a fan of Trails Worth Hiking and its listeners that he is considering joining the trip himself, along with his guides and porters. I expect the group size to be 10 to 12 trekkers, ideally, plus the guides and porters. So again, you will only carry a day pack. And we'll be making this trek into a future episode of Trails Worth Hiking, since we don't have one yet on the Annapurna Base Camp trek. So you'll also have the opportunity to talk about the trip on the show if you want to do that. This trip will begin October 18th, 2026. Both of these amazing adventures are designed to fit within a 2-week vacation, even if just barely, though the Chitwan National Park Safari add-on in Nepal would take additional time. In any event, you have plenty of time to plan for one or even both of these amazing adventures. For the Costa Rica trip, Emma has created an expression of interest form that I'll link to below in the show notes, so you can reach out to her directly through that if you'd like to express interest in going on the trip and to get some of the details. And I've also linked below to Rajan's page at Earthbound Expeditions website, where he talks about the Annapurna Base Camp trip, so you can see what that entails as well. So feel free to reach out directly to them if you'd like, or if you want to reach out to me first, I can answer any questions that you might have and then let them know of your interest and get them in touch with you. So you can reach out to me now at trailsworthhiking@gmail.com or touch base through Instagram direct messaging on our Instagram account at Trails Worth Hiking Podcast. To book your spot on the trip, you'll pay a deposit, but the rest won't be due until much closer in time to the trip. So there you have it. I'm really excited about this. I'd love to go trekking with you in Costa Rica or Nepal, or both. Our first group hike in Point Reyes in March was a real success, and it helped to confirm for me that what I really want to do is get out there on the trail with you wonderful people who I am so blessed to have listened to this show and who share with me a passion for adventure, exploration, learning, culture, nature, and self-discovery, among other things. So please reach out to me so that you can join me on one or both of these adventures. All right, now let's jump into today's episode. Our guest on the show is listener Peter Celeste. For the last several years, Peter and his wife Victoria have taken to trekking with gusto, starting with this trek, but as we'll talk about, he's also done some other big treks like the Camino de Santiago and is doing several treks this year, including the Everest Base Camp trek, which he mentions during our conversation as his next hike in April, which now has passed, and he recently returned from. And it sounds like he had an epic adventure going to Everest Base Camp, which is no surprise. This is only our second episode in Africa. Check out episode 27, the Rwenzori Central Circuit, for another great trip in Africa. That one is in Uganda, which is actually not that far from this trip, at least on the big scale of things in Africa. I've had several requests to cover this trail, so I'm glad I was able to connect with Peter about it. Mount Kilimanjaro is the highest peak in Africa. Unlike the high peaks on other continents, particularly like Everest or Denali or Aconcagua, Mount Kilimanjaro is trekkable by everyday hikers like you and me. It doesn't require climbing gear or specialized training. That doesn't mean it's not difficult. It is, but it's doable and it's iconic. So let's talk about it. Mount Kilimanjaro is in Tanzania, a country in East Africa. As you know, I often talk about the history of human presence in an area, which I'll do here as well, but it's interesting because where this hike is in a region where humanity has been since it became humanity. There's lots of early hominid fossils that have been found in the area. Look up Olduvai Gorge and the 2 million years of evolution found there, and you'll see what I mean. We'll talk in a minute about the more recent history of the Bantu-speaking people in the Mount Kilimanjaro region. Mount Kilimanjaro is in the northeast of the country. It's in a mountainous and forested region of the country, which was actually surprising to me because when I think of Tanzania, having never been there, what comes to mind for me are the plains of the Serengeti and safaris, which are also part of Tanzania. Tanzania has a colonial history like much of Africa. It was a German colony, and then after World War I, it became a British colony. British rule ended in 1961, and although it stayed as part of the British Commonwealth, it became independent in 1962. The name Tanzania was adopted in 1964 after Tanganyika united with Zanzibar, which are a group of islands offshore of Tanzania. The new name was a combination of those two names, Tanganyika and Zanzibar. There are 62 million people in Tanzania. It's the most populated country in the world entirely south of the equator, although it's barely south of the equator, but it is. It's a very diverse country with 125 ethnic groups and more than 100 languages spoken. Swahili and English are widely spoken, and many people speak both Swahili and English in addition to maybe a more local language as well. Tanzania is considered one of the safest and most politically stable countries in Africa as well. Mount Kilimanjaro itself is a dormant volcano formed over 2 million years ago. It's formed by the East African Rift, where the African plate is being pulled apart into two separate tectonic plates, and that causes the volcanic activity there. It's a large stratovolcano, which we've talked about before on the show. A stratovolcano is one that has layers that are formed by successive eruptions that make it taller and taller. There are 3 separate cones on Kilimanjaro. Kibo is the highest, and though it's dormant, it could erupt again. As I mentioned before, it's the highest mountain in Africa. It's 19,341 feet at the summit, which is 5,895 meters. And also, as I mentioned, it's the highest freestanding mountain in the world above sea level at 16,100 feet or 4,900 meters above its base. The origin of the name Kilimanjaro is unknown. It could be a local word meaning unclimbable, which it may have seemed to be for a long time. Or in Swahili, it could be referring to the mountain of greatness, or potentially mountain of caravans, because it would have been a beacon for caravans coming by. Or it could even be mountain of whiteness, referring to the snows. The highest peak on the mountain, the summit that everyone climbs to, is Uhuru Peak, which means Freedom Peak in Swahili. We've talked about the whiteness, and we've talked about the snows of Kilimanjaro that Hemingway wrote about. There is a large ice cap on top of Kilimanjaro. It has the largest glaciers in Africa, but it is rapidly shrinking. 80% of the ice cap of Kilimanjaro was lost in the 20th century, and the rate of loss annually has increased substantially in recent times. The ice cap on Kilimanjaro is projected to be gone completely by 2050. So only 25 years from now, there will no longer be any snows of Kilimanjaro. There's, as you might imagine, diverse flora and fauna in the area. As far as fauna goes, there are elephants and Cape buffaloes in the lower elevations near the mountain. There are several types of antelope, bush bucks, dik-diks, which are a small antelope, and duikers. There are mongooses and warthogs. Zebras, leopards, and hyenas have been known to be seen on the Shira Plateau on the shoulder of the mountain. There are blue monkeys and black and white colubuses in the montane forests. There's even a chameleon that's native to the area. I mentioned earlier that there are Bantu-speaking people in the area. Let's come back to that now. Bantu-speaking people are believed to have begun migrating to the Mount Kilimanjaro area about 5 or 6 centuries ago, though it could go back even earlier. They're widespread across the southern half of Africa, and Bantu-speaking people are believed to have origins in West Central Africa about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago near modern Cameroon and Nigeria. In the Mount Kilimanjaro region, they've been called the Chaga people. The Chaga are the third largest ethnic group in Tanzania. They're known for agriculture and trading. Their agriculture has been fairly successful because they have very fertile volcanic soil on the shoulder of Mount Kilimanjaro. They have also built pretty sophisticated irrigation systems to help them with their farming. In the 17th century, there were independent kingdoms established on the slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro called the Chaga kingdoms. There were a few dozen autonomous kingdoms when the Europeans first arrived, though they eventually ended up under military control of the German colonials. So let's talk about the history of European contact with the mountain. A German missionary was the first modern European to report the existence of the mountain in 1848, though he may not be the first non-African to have noticed the mountain. There's even reports by Ptolemy, going back to the time of Alexander the Great, of spotting the mountain, though it's not entirely clear whether he was referring to Mount Kilimanjaro or Mount Kenya. But as far as modern history goes, it was a German missionary. There were several attempts to climb the mountain in the second half of the 19th century, and successive attempts got closer and closer until October 1889, when German geology professor Hans Meyer and Austrian mountaineer Ludwig Pertscheller first reached the summit. Today, Mount Kilimanjaro is part of Kilimanjaro National Park, which was established in 1973. The park originally encompassed the mountain above tree line, but was expanded in 2005 to include the forest around it, which had previously been a separate reserve. Also back in 1987, the area was made a UNESCO World Heritage Site. As far as climbing goes, there are 7 established climbing routes. Our guest, of course, only climbed one route, so let me talk briefly about the different routes so you have a sense of them. And then we can talk about the route that Peter and his wife Victoria took. There's the Lemosho route, which approaches from the west and is arguably the most beautiful route. It is very popular, takes a little bit longer than some of the other routes. There's the Machame route, which is the most popular. It goes up the southern slope. There's the Marangu route, which is the only route that has hut accommodations. The others you have to camp in a tent. There's the Rongai route. This is the only route that climbs the northern slope. There's the Shira route that starts at high elevation on the Shira Plateau. There's the Northern Circuit, which is a new and long route that starts on the west but then circles north. And there's the Umbwe route, which is the shortest, steepest, and hardest of the routes. It goes up the southern slope. All right. So with all that said, which route did Peter and Victoria take? Well, the company they went with, Thompson Treks, has a route that they call the Western Approach, which appears to be a combination of the Shira and Lemosho routes for a 9-day trek, which is reportedly far less crowded than the Machame or Marangu routes. And so I guess this is really an 8th possible route. It's not exactly one of the 7 I just mentioned. So that's another option. You have lots of options depending on the time you have, the money you have, and the kind of climb you want to do. One note, there's a camp near the top called the Barafu Camp, which 4 of the 7 routes reach. And most of these routes and their guiding companies use that camp as the last night place to stay before making a summit attempt. Listener and former guest on the show, Gary Black. Gary was our guest on the Asongate and Rainbow Mountain episode about Peru. He mentioned that there's a higher up camp called Kosovo that can make the summit push much easier. That said, of course, you'd have to be acclimatized enough to be able to sleep even higher for that to be an option. It sounds like something to potentially discuss with the guide company if you are on a route where this could be an option. Anyway, just wanted to mention that as Gary brought it to my attention. As far as summiting Kilimanjaro, 30 to 50,000 people attempt to climb Mount Kilimanjaro every year. About two-thirds are successful. Altitude sickness is the biggest issue that can come up. Thompson Treks, which Peter and Victoria used, advertises a 98% success rate for their western approach route, which takes a long, slow acclimatization approach to the summit. All right. With that background, let's talk to Peter Celeste about his climb of Mount Kilimanjaro. Peter Celeste, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, Jeremy, thanks for having me.
So you've been an avid hiker for a while, but it seems like only more recently have you gotten into doing longer trekking adventures, particularly international trips. Tell me about that and how that came about.
Yeah, so what I found was my wife and I, we were enjoying hiking a lot more, and we were doing a lot of national parks. And then we had heard of a friend tell us about Kilimanjaro, and we did a little bit of research, and we thought, wow, that could be truly epic. And that was our first of many kind of longer treks. We kind of liked the hut to hut. Kilimanjaro wasn't necessarily that, it was tents, but it was assisted, as we'll talk about.
Yeah. Cool. So you did that one first. I didn't realize that. And then I know you've done the Camino de Santiago and the
Right.
Kumano Kodo. So you've
Yep.
actually done a few other ones
Yep.
since then.
Yeah, and the other one I did more recently was the Cotswold Way in England.
Oh, cool. I'd
Hmm.
be interested to hear about that, but maybe not today.
Yeah,
Okay, the one thing I've been trying to get at that you're not giving up is that you also recently retired.
I did.
Is that what is making some of this possible?
It is. It is. So these are big treks, as you know, and they're far away. So you got to get there. You got to get used to the time change, and then you got anywhere from, in the case of Kilimanjaro, was a 9 day kind of end-to-end hike. In the case of the Camino de Santiago, it was 45 days, which of course is
Sure.
only really doable if you own your own business or you're retired.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, how did it come about that you found the idea of doing Mount Kilimanjaro and decided to go do that, especially when you hadn't done multi-day treks before?
Right. Yeah, so it really the seed of the idea was from a friend that did it. I started reading about it, and when I really thought about it, I was thinking, wow, so highest mountain in Africa, pretty cool. Cultural experience, pretty cool. It was not a technically difficult hike, so you don't need to be there's no technical element to it, but you do have kind of the altitude, which of course is a challenge. But everything I read was if you're fit and you take your time going up the mountain, you have a pretty good chance of making it. So I think for us, we added all those things together and said, boy, that could be a really amazing trip. And it was. It was fantastic.
How much altitude had you experienced before that? And what did you think about that as a sort of risk factor? And,
Right.
even people who are very fit sometimes react negatively to high altitude.
Yeah, so I had done a number of 14ers before that, and I had really no problems there. I've also been down, in parts of the Andes in South America, and I had a slight headache in some of those places, but for the most part, no real altitude. So I figured, and again, it was everything I read. If you're really fit, that gives you your very best chance, and that's what we said is we're going to just get incredibly fit to do it.
So, what did you do to figure out how you're going to plan this or which guide company to go with and which route to do? How did you think about those issues?
Yeah, so a lot of research online, and we wanted to make sure that we picked the right company. So of course, our friend that did it that had a good experience, that was the first place that we started. But then it was just looking at who else offers tracks, and of course, there's a lot of companies that are out there. And we started kind of narrowing it down to say, okay, well, let's consider things like success rate. That really depended a lot on the number of days. So we read things like if you try to do it in 6 days, you might have like a 45% chance of making it. If you do it in 7 days, it might be 65%. And if you do it in 8 days, it could be as high as 80 or 85%. And we ultimately found Thompson Treks. That was the company that we used. They had a 98% success rating. And when I really looked into them, there's a lot of things I really liked about Thompson Trek. So they gave a lot back to the community. So I felt that they treated their porters very well. They required that all their guides were certified, that had done 100 or more summits. That was something that we cared about. And then to the extent possible that there was some degree of comfort involved, right? So we really looked at things like the tents, and they had really good tents, tents designed for, let's say, 3 or even 4 people, but we only had 2 of us in there. They had an incredible number of porters for the group. So I think our group, we had 4 altogether. So my wife and I and 2 others, and there must have been 20 plus people on the trek itself. So there was a lot. And, they were carrying our stuff. We had a personal porter that would set up our tent, carry our bags, that would bring a bowl of like warm water every morning. And that was washy. And, that was the extent of our showers while we were on the mountain. There was a dining tent. So, of course, they brought all the food, they brought the water. There was our own private toilet tent, which was also nice. So, it was probably a little bit on the higher end of the range from a cost perspective, but it really was a quality outfit end to end.
Okay, I have so many questions to come out of that. But one thing that I want to start with is just highlighting for people how you started that answer, which is the different success rates based on the number of days. And that really highlights and emphasizes the power of acclimatization.
Yeah.
Because the shorter days you have to do it, the much harder it's going to be on you from an altitude perspective. And so if you're willing to put in the time to do 8 or 9 days,
right,
like you guys did, the success rate just goes way up.
It absolutely does. And from our perspective, we had already flown all the way out there. It's a long way, right? I mean, we flew through Istanbul to get there. So you already have, I don't know, 12-hour flight to get there, and then another 7 or 8 hours to get down to Tanzania. So it is a long way. It's one of those kind of epic adventures you're probably only going to do once. So you want to increase the likelihood of making it. So for us, cutting a day here and there and saving a few $100 just was not worth it at all.
One of the other things you said was about these different components of the camp setup with the bathroom tent, and I'm sure there's a kitchen, and then there's the sleeping tents. Mm-hmm. Is that all take down and set up each day, or are those established camps?
Yeah, so no, it is taken down and set up each day. So the porters, I mean, these guys were truly amazing. And that was another thing we really liked about Thompson is they did kind of outfit their porters with the appropriate kind of equipment, and that included shoes. And we saw some porters up there that were wearing tennis shoes for other companies, wearing tennis shoes that might have been 3 or 4 sizes too big. But these guys were amazing. So they would have these duffel bags that were huge, and they just put it on their heads. And here we are. We got all of our great camping gear, and we have our trekking poles, and our fancy boots, and we're walking up the mountain. And these guys are just jogging by,
Yeah.
right? With a pair of tennis shoes and a t-shirt, and they're just flying up the mountain. And they would run ahead. So we'd have breakfast. We would break camp every day. They would break down camp. They would put everything in. They would run ahead, set up the lunch tent and meal for us. So we'd walk, and that'd all be set up and ready to go. We'd have lunch, and then we'd continue on. And by the time we got to the final destination, the whole camp would be set up and it would be ready to go for the next day. It was incredible.
So I think I need to ask about cost, because people are going to wonder about that with a trip like this. First of all, it's expensive to get to Africa and to get to parts of Africa, just transportation wise, as I understand it. But also you've got probably a wide range of trekking companies and what they offer and how much it will cost. And you said this is sort of on the higher end, probably because of all the support. Mm-hmm. What do you think is, without having to tell people exactly what your trip costs, what do you think is the sort of, or unless you're comfortable with that, but what do you think is the range roughly of from a low end trip to a more high end trip?
I'd say that the prices can change pretty substantially from a few $1,000s to, like we paid around $6,000 if I remember correctly.
Okay.
I remember seeing some that were maybe half that cost, but that was shorter days. They didn't have anywhere near as much support. And for us, that just was not worth it. I mean, it's hard enough already to be on the mountain, in the elements. So we wanted to have a little bit of comfort there. And then we also wanted a company that had a good reputation, that had that high success rate, that had the trained, guides and certified guides and training porters, and all that made a difference for us.
Was it 6,000 for the couple or for each of you?
For each.
Okay. Now that's what I thought, but I just wanted to be clear about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. No, that makes sense. And with an extensive team like you've described, that's not crazy that it would cost that kind of money.
Right.
What time of year is the best time to do this trek?
Yeah. So I think there's different times. You can go in the fall. is a good time of year, or you can go kind of in our winter, which is their dry season. So we went at the end of January. You're walking through, of course, another one of the reasons we went on the hike is that you walk through 5 different climate zones, which is really very cool. But the weather, it changes a lot. So you want to go in the dry season, even though that you're not guaranteed dry weather, of course. But when we started, which is in the lower elevations of like 6 to 8,000 feet, it was sunny, warm. You were hiking in shorts and a t-shirt. And then by the time you got to the very top, you were in every layer that you owned and heavy, down parkas and everything else. I mean, it was really cold, single digit cold. So the weather for us was that range. So you really had to bring layers. It did rain on us one day, and it rained a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And, again, back to the tents, we thought for sure we were going to be like sopping wet, laying there in a wet bed all night. And those tents were amazing. Not a drop of rain came in. It was really impressive. And then on the last day, the summit day, it snowed.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So we went through all the elements in that 1 week period.
Which route did you choose and how did you decide on that? Because as I understand it, there are multiple routes that you have as an option.
Yeah, so we did what they call the Western route, and that is the longer route. So it's technically a 9-day route. You spend 2 days kind of at their, just kind of getting settled from your flight and everything. So they have a nice kind of lodge at the bottom of the mountain, and we spent 2 days there. And they had kind of walks around. You're carrying your packs, or you're starting to get used to it. I mean, we had already done that in the training, so that that wasn't a big deal for us. But 2 days there, and then it was 7 days up and 2 days down. That was the trek. Now, the only difference for us is we actually came down in one day because all 4 of the people in our group said, yeah, we want to do that. So it was a long day. It was about 10,000 feet of coming down in a single day, which is a lot. And it was probably, I don't know, 8 or so hours. But for us, we were kind of ready. We wanted to get off the mountain, and we had had a great experience, and it was time.
I know that feeling of wanting to get done when you're on your way back from a trip.
Yeah.
But also, man, that's a knee buster, even with poles.
Yeah, that was a tough one.
Okay, so the Western route, how far
Yep.
is that in either miles or kilometers?
Yeah, 45 miles.
Okay.
It was 45 miles, and there were, like I said, we had 7 stages kind of hiking up the mountain, going through 5 climate zones.
Okay. And so based on what you're saying, coming down in one day, that's 45 miles round trip.
45 miles round trip. Yeah, so it's a much straighter route coming straight down, and you also come down in a different place than where you started.
Oh, you do? Okay. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. And so that's about 9 days. And the elevation range, what did you say the elevation was roughly where you start at the lodge?
The lodge itself was around 6,000 feet, if I remember correctly. And then the trailhead was 7,800 feet of elevation.
Okay. And then the summit is 19,340.
Yeah, that's right.
Tallest mountain in Africa.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's 5,895 meters. So talk me through a little bit how acclimatization worked for you guys during this trip, for both you and your wife, and maybe the other couple as well. Did the slower pace really make it pretty straightforward for everyone, or were there difficulties, or did you have to take Diamox or anything like that?
Personally, I had no problem with the altitude. My wife only had an issue on really the last day, the day that she summited. She got all the way to the top and then started feeling a little off on the summit. And then on the way down, she felt a little bit worse. And the other 2 trekkers were fine. But the way essentially that we do it, and it's pretty common, you climb high, you sleep low. And that's essentially what they did. So they would walk us a certain distance, we would go much higher, and then we'd come back down and sleep a little bit lower. And we pretty much did that every day. So of course, if you probably add up the real number of miles we walked, it was probably much further than 45 miles. But that worked for me. I think it worked pretty well. When I kind of look back on the elevation gains and the distances per day, they only ranged maybe anywhere from 1,300 feet to like 2,500 feet per day of elevation gain. Except for the last day, which was about 4,000 feet of elevation gain, and then coming back down. So you went from the camp right below the summit up 4,000 feet and then back to the summit. That was by far the longest day. That was really hard.
So that raises my next question, which is what are you actually carrying versus what the porters are carrying?
So we each had a day pack, and we would carry water. They would give us snacks, and then we would bring layers. That was probably the most of what we carried. So depending on the day, you might have your rain parka in there. We also had like a rain poncho. They suggested both, and the one day that it rained, we were glad we had both. Then we had trekking poles. I usually don't use trekking poles personally going up so much, but I use them a lot going down. But I brought them just in case. But really, that was pretty much it. I mean, if you have a bigger camera that you want to take, of course you could carry that. And I think one of the four did have that bigger camera. But outside of that, it wasn't really a lot. The porters carried almost everything.
What are you bringing from the United States when you go there versus what they're providing? So, for example, like a heavy parka, is that your heavy parka or are they providing that?
No, that was something that we rented from them. But they brought, for example, crampons. They had crampons for the top of the mountain. We could rent those, and we did. The heavy parka, the heavy down jacket, we definitely had. In fact, I think I had one of those, and they suggested that you bring another medium one from what we had brought, and I said, okay, let's do that. And then the only other thing I can remember is gaiters, and that was mostly for the scree. There was a lot of scree coming down the top of the mountain, and they did suggest gaiters, and we did not have those, so that was another thing that we got from them.
As far as the route you went on, how much of it is actually a trail versus just sort of the guides taking you up scree or something like that?
Yeah, it's the whole thing is a trail.
Okay.
It's a pretty clear path. It's not necessarily that well marked, but you can definitely see kind of the walking, just from usage where people are walking. And the other thing too is there's definitely a number of people. I mean, there were some times when we were walking, we didn't see anybody else, but when you would hit kind of bottleneck areas, you saw other hikers that were there. So you just kind of followed the trail and followed the line of folks. But it really, at no point did I feel that the trail was crowded or overcrowded, but you would see occasional hikers in different places for sure.
So, how do you get to this area? You mentioned going through Istanbul on a flight to
Yeah.
Tanzania. How do you actually get to
Yep.
where Mount Kilimanjaro is?
So we flew into, and most people fly into Kilimanjaro Airport, which is JRO, I think is the airport code. That's services the city of Arusha in Tanzania. The airport sits a little bit, it really actually sits right between Kilimanjaro, the mountain, and Arusha, the city. So you land there, and then they actually picked us up and they drove us from the airport directly into camp. So it was really easy. They made it incredibly easy. And then when we finished the hike, they took us from the end of the hike trail back into Arusha, and we spent the day there. That was a little bit further. So the drive from the airport to the camp was probably, or to the lodge was probably an hour to hour and a half. And then from the end of the trail into Arusha was about 2.5 to 3 hours, a little bit further.
Are there other things to see and do in the area? I imagine some people might combine this with a safari, even, or something like that.
Yeah, my wife and I, we actually went to Rwanda and we saw the gorillas and the golden monkeys before, and that was absolutely spectacular. That is an incredible experience if anybody has an interest in doing that. And then because we came down in a shorter amount of time, so we came down in one day instead of 2 days, we went to Arusha National Park. And if you've never been on a safari, it's pretty cool. If you have been on one, it's probably one of the smaller parks, so you're not
Hmm.
going to get the animal density of like an Ngorongoro crater or the Serengeti, but it's not far, and it is, pretty cool if you've never seen anything like that. I mean, there's all kinds of animals walking around, elephants and giraffes, and a whole lot of other really interesting animals to see.
One more thing I wanted to hit on about the hike itself that it occurred to me is you mentioned you did this with tents, and that makes sense because apparently on the Western route, that's probably the way to do it, right?
Yeah.
My understanding is there are huts and there is a hut system for some of the other routes on this mountain. Did you have any understanding of how that worked and whether those were, how those accommodations are set up?
I didn't really spend too much time on that because we had identified the longer route as probably the preferred route due to the success rate. But I did see that some of them, I think there's a route called the Coca-Cola route or something like that. And that's the one I think that has the huts on it, if I remember correctly. But I didn't spend a lot of time. I would assume they're pretty basic. You're not glamping.
Hmm.
I think it's a pretty basic hut that's up there. It's probably dormitory style, if I remember correctly. But that I probably need to check that.
So when you're up on this mountain, what are you seeing? What does it feel like? What does it look like? What are the views?
Yeah, no, it's incredible. So there's 5 different climate zones. The first one is what they call the cultivated zone. And that's kind of the 3,000 to 6,000 feet. So what that one has is, if you think about your farmland, your villages, that's where a lot of the people live, and you actually see some of that as you're driving to the camps, which is kind of nice. It gives you a view into the kind of a little bit of the culture of the Tanzanian people, which is nice to see. When you start your hike, the first day you're walking through the rainforest zone. And it's amazing. I mean, there's big, beautiful trees everywhere. You see and hear monkeys and birds. It's wet and lush and green. And like I said, it's warm, actually. The elevation gain there is this rainforest zone is about 6,000 to 9,000 feet. So that's the height of it, or the range of it. So that's kind of the first zone. And then after that, you get to what they call the moorland zone. And the moorland zone is 9,000 feet to roughly 13,000 feet. And this one I thought this was the most interesting section. It was kind of like Dr. Seuss type weird plants and things. So you have kind of a lot of heath out there, a lot of heath-like vegetation, wildflowers, some open spaces. But you also have these really interesting trees. Like the main one is what they call the giant groundsel. It's got a fairly big wooden trunk, but then it's got this really dense kind of canopy of leaves that sits on top of it.
Hmm.
But these can grow up to 15 or 20 feet tall. And apparently this is the only place in the world that they grow. So you kind of walk through like a little forest of these things, and it just feels like you're on a different planet, really completely. And apparently there's a few other smaller animals in this area. We didn't see any of those, but I thought the vegetation in this area, the flora, was actually really interesting to see. And then once you get through the moorland zone, you move into the alpine desert zone. And this is the zone that is this one is more in the 13,000 feet to like 16,000 feet
Hmm.
range. And you see like a lot of volcanic rocks, some sparse vegetation, a lot of lichens around, kind of little all over the rocks and stuff. And that's pretty interesting. There's no real animals in this zone, so you're kind of already entering in like this moon-like type, feel and look. And it's really barren. But the interesting thing is when it is clear, you can just see for miles. You see over the countryside, and it's just gorgeous. You're way above the clouds. It's actually really, really pretty. And then the last zone is really the summit day, and that's the Arctic zone. And of course, that's where you got, ice and snow, and you do see some glaciers, which is pretty cool. And that's where it was really cold. It was down into the single digits, and it did snow on us going up. But when you get there, it's really just an incredible experience. Now, for us that day, because it was snowing, you couldn't see.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, we didn't have a
Yeah.
view on the top of the mountain, but it really was. I mean, the whole thing. Throughout the course of the week, especially at night, you get to your camp in the middle of the day. You have a chance to sit around and tell stories, and then you have some really good food. But you're sitting out, and when the stars come out, it's just unbelievable. There is no kind of light pollution that's up there at that kind of elevation, and you're so close to the stars, and it's just an incredible canopy. And then again, you can kind of see out over the Tanzanian countryside. It's a beautiful thing.
How is the trail itself as far as the way it's routed? Was it sort of back and forth, or is this straight up just gaining elevation, or?
You don't really backtrack all that much. You start and you kind of just go camp to camp to camp, and they're all pretty much in a linear fashion. Now, when you get towards the end, there was one point on the hike called the Branco Wall, and it was between the fifth and the sixth day, and it was an 850-foot scramble. So think of it as like this steep rocky ridge that you kind of have to go up, and it was considered a class 4 scramble. So you don't need any equipment necessarily to go up, but you are going to need both your hands and your legs to kind of
Hmm.
scramble up the wall. And that was actually really fun, kind of doing that. But I think outside of that, yeah, it was pretty much straight up. It was really just you keep walking in the same direction, and then you get to the base of the summit and you camp there, and then you make the final push the next day.
And are the mileages roughly similar per day, or how are they dividing up how far you go each day?
Yeah, I thought about that, and I was actually reviewing my notes, and I don't remember how many miles we actually walked. They just basically, I remember the hours.
Okay.
It was like 4 or 5 hours or 6 or 7 hours,
Yeah.
and then the last day was like 8 to 10 hours.
Sure.
But that was kind of it. It was basically 4 to 6 hours per day. And Most days, except for the last day, were pretty consistent. I would imagine we just divide up kind of the most of the 45, and that's what it's going to be.
Yeah, I think people who have hiked trails like the Camino de Santiago might think, well, that's not a very long day. But the point of doing 4 to 6 hours in a hike like this is to do as much as you can reasonably do
Right.
and then spend time to acclimatize.
That's right.
Because if you try to do more, you're just going to have problems.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. In fact, what they say is the people that don't make it, and that end up having altitude issues are the younger, more healthy people because they're like, oh, I feel fine, I feel great, I can keep going, no problem. And they push themselves too far and they don't let their bodies acclimatize. And we certainly, I mean, we trained a lot and I never felt tired really one day. So I felt I could have kept going. And in fact, we asked the guides, a couple times, can we just take little walks around, our camp? Can you take us on a little 2 or 3 mile circuit or something? The distance was not hard. It's the combination of the elements and the altitude that make it hard.
So for people who have done regular trail hiking over several days, but haven't attempted a major climb like this, even though it's not a technical climb, there is the altitude element. If somebody's thinking about this as a trip that they might want to do, or maybe their first time, like you did it as your first multi-day trip,
Right.
what would you say? Do you think it's a good idea for somebody to give this a shot as their first multi-day trip, or if they have never done this kind of altitude?
Yeah, I think we had never done altitude really. I mean, other than 14ers, I mean, you are getting up to that 14,000 foot level, so there's some element of that. But I think, again, if you really just spend time getting very fit, it's a very doable hike. It's challenging because of the elements. It's challenging because you're sleeping in a tent. It's cold, and you're dealing with all the different weather. But it is a very achievable hike for people that take their time and that are reasonably fit.
Do you have a particular moment or memory that stands out for you from this hike?
So it was on the last day, and you get up, pre-dawn, and you're working your way up, and 4,000 feet of elevation gain, basically starting around 15,000 feet and working way up to 19,000 feet. That's a pretty tough hike. So when you finally kind of walk up and you see the Kilimanjaro sign, wow, that is a moment. And my wife and I, we saw it and we're looking at it and we just grab each other and we give each other a kiss, and that really is the highlight for us. And one of our porters snapped a picture of that of us, and that is my best moment. Absolutely.
Nice. Was there anything that happened that you didn't expect, or if you thought about doing it next time, not that you would do it again, but if you were advising somebody else, is there something you would advise them to do differently than what you guys did?
Of course, you can't control the weather. Of course, the one thing that would have been nice is not the torrential downpour that we experienced one day, but that in itself even brought a different element to the trek. I mean, it kind of, in its own way, it was kind of fun and it was different, and it was cold and wet, but at the same time, it was something that was unique. But really outside of that, I think back if I would have changed anything, and I can't really think of it. I mean, we were very, very happy with the selection of the trekking company. The people were really top quality people, super nice, really friendly, spoke good English, knew what they were doing. We felt really comfortable with them. The people that we trek with, one was actually the IT director of Thompson itself.
Oh, wow.
He was an avid hiker and he was a great guy. And there was a doctor, this lady from Wisconsin. That was great, and they were both avid hikers, and we told a lot of different stories to each other about where we had been and what we had done. That part was great. And for us also kind of bolting on Rwanda on the front end was really just made the whole thing just incredible. So no, I don't think I would really change anything. I was super happy with what we took. I would not have liked to take 2 days to get down. So I was really happy everybody was in agreement that we can go down in one day, because what the guide said is everybody has to agree or you guys have to do 2 days.
Yeah, that makes sense. And about the weather, I mean, I think the only thing to say there is that as long as you were prepared for it, you did it the way you should have done it.
Yeah.
Because you can't control the weather, of course, but you can control how you experience it if you have the right gear.
Right.
All right. Well, Peter, thank you for telling us about your climb of Mount Kilimanjaro. People always ask me if I'm going to do that trip, and I never know if it's something I want to do or not. But every time I do an interview like this, and then I hear somebody talk about the hike they did, it does always make me want to do it. So
it's an epic hike, and I would highly recommend it. And the different climate zones and the cultural differences that you experience when you're there. When we finished the hike and we came down at the base of the mountain, all the guides kind of got together and they did like a traditional song and dance, and it was just so cool to see that. And of course, we had spent over a week with them, and we knew them well, and kind of seeing that and laughing and hugging with them and just having shared in that overall experience, it was incredible. And the views are spectacular. It was very, very cool and something I highly recommend to anybody.
All right, another one for the list.
Yeah,
Okay, while I have you though, I've got a few more questions if you don't mind.
sure.
What is the next trip on your list?
Yeah, so now that we have gotten into these long distance hikes, we're addicted, so to speak. So in April, so in 2 months, we are going to the Everest Base Camp. We're going to do Everest Base Camp in Nepal, and we're going to do that via the Goiko circuit.
Okay.
So we're really excited about that one. So that's the next one. And then this summer, we're going to go into the Alps in Europe, and we're going to do the Haute route. So we're going to go from Chamonix in France to Zermatt in Switzerland. And then later that summer, we're going to do the West Highland Way in Scotland. So we have a very full docket this year on our plate. Again, only doable because we're retired.
I was just going to say, you're making it seem very appealing to be retired. What's the worst weather you've ever experienced while outdoors, and how did you handle it?
Yeah. So the worst weather was on the Camino de Santiago. So one day, I remember looking at kind of the weather app and seeing that there were going to be thunderstorms coming in. And some of these weather apps, they can get pretty detailed. So I was kind of looking at that and I was measuring the distance and I was thinking, gosh, I think I can beat it because if I wait, it's gonna, I'm not gonna be able to leave for several hours. So I got up early and I went for it. And I'm in the middle of this field and the storm comes in faster than I expected. And I'm the tallest thing around, and there's lightning everywhere, and it's big and it's loud, and the rain is blowing sideways, and there was just absolutely no cover at all.
What did you do?
Well, I kept walking because I could have maybe found a ditch and laid in a ditch or something, but it was so wet that there were puddles of water anywhere, and I just said, it's either going to hit me or it's not. So I just kept walking, and I don't know if that was the right decision or not, but walking it kind of towards the end there, but certainly was a terrible decision trying to beat the storm.
Yeah, that's a good lesson to learn. If you know it's coming in, adjust accordingly.
Yeah.
All right, last question. What is the most valuable thing that trekking or hiking has taught you?
I traveled a lot for work over the years, and I've been to a lot of big cities, and I've traveled to a lot of different countries. And my wife is from Spain, so we've, of course, have spent a lot of time there. But when you really think about it, most people, and ourselves included, we went to a lot of the touristy destinations, and you see the cities, you see the cool sites, and they are cool. But what I found that trekking does is it gives you a view into the real country, and sometimes it's rural, but not always. Like in the Camino de Santiago, you walk through some bigger cities, and you walk through some smaller towns, and you walk through tiny, tiny little hamlets. But you really got a sense for the real Spain on that hike, and you got to meet local people and see local customs. And you just get a really different perspective. You just slow down and you can really kind of smell the roses, and you get a very different perspective than flying into Barcelona for 2 days. And I love Barcelona, but of course it's just a very different experience, and it's a real experience, and it's one that we really treasure.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I couldn't agree more with that. A lot of times when I go hiking to an area, I see it in such a way that I couldn't have seen it in a city. And when I go talk to my friends about going to that country, it's like we were in completely different places. Like they have no frame of reference for the way I saw the country. I guess it just goes back to the thinking that there's no better way to really see anywhere than to walk through it.
Yeah.
Because you can just see so much more.
You see so much more, and you really see a part of the country that most people aren't seeing. When I did the Kilimanjaro in Japan, you're walking through the southernmost peninsula, and you're in these tiny little rural villages, and it's just green mountains up and down, and you don't have the crowds of people, and you don't have the crazy technology that Japan is known for. It's the real Japan, and it's a beautiful thing.
Peter Celeste, thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Yeah, Jeremy, thanks so much for having me.
Thanks again to Peter Celeste, and I hope that Peter and I have inspired you to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. And if you enjoyed this episode, tell a friend about it, or better yet, give us a good review on whichever podcast service you use. And keep in mind that this podcast is entertainment and meant to spark your interest. If you decide to hike the trail, do your own research. Like anything else worth doing, outdoor adventure has risk. So when you go, pack your common sense, and when you get back, tell me how it went. Before we go, I want to remind you about our sponsor, Outdoor Herbivore, which makes delicious vegetarian and vegan backpacking meals, though as I always say, you don't need to be a vegetarian or vegan to enjoy them. They have quality ingredients and are easy to prepare and will keep you satisfied on the trail. Outdoor Herbivore for a long time had a discount code for listeners, and then we had several special offers over the last several months, but we are bringing back the discount code. So you can go on Outdoor Herbivore's website and pick anything you want, not just one of the special packages we had arranged before, and get a discount of 10% off with the discount code TWH10P. So that's capital TWH, 10 capital P. So Trails Worth Hiking 10%. That discount code is back and will be in effect for a while. So I hope you take advantage of it and buy lots of backpacking meals for the upcoming summer hiking season. All right, next time on Trails Worth Hiking, we'll be hiking in a remote and beautiful desert canyon in the southwestern United States. Unlike this episode, this will be for a hike that takes us down to our destination rather than up, and will take us through a town that is only accessible on foot or by mule or helicopter to what many call the most isolated town in the United States. As we return to the Grand Canyon, but this isn't a hike down to the Colorado River within Grand Canyon National Park. This hike is to the beautiful blue-green waters of Havasu Falls within Havasu Canyon on the Havasupai Trail on the Havasupai Indian Reservation in Arizona. If you have any questions or feedback on this episode or ideas for future episodes, including if you want to be a guest and talk about a trail that you've hiked, reach out to me at trailsworthhiking@gmail.com. And as I said in the beginning of the show, please reach out to me about these two amazing adventures I've set up for you. If you want to go to Costa Rica and hike with me or Nepal, please reach out to me and let's make that happen. So start planning your next hike, and before you know it, you'll be on the trail. Thanks for listening.